Welcome back to our deep dive. Today, we are starting with a map of the world. But I want you to imagine that the lines on that map, they aren't printed in ink.
Right, they're drawn in pencil.
Exactly. They're drawn in pencil. And there are people, very powerful people, standing around the table holding erasers.
That is a slightly ominous way to start, but it's completely accurate. We are talking about the invisible machinery of statehood today.
We are. And to do that, we're looking at a tale of two very different places, two timelines that run almost parallel but end up in completely different universes.
Germany and Somaliland.
Right. So let's set the scene for you. It's the early 1990s. The world is kind of turning upside down. In October 1990, Germany reunites. The Berlin Wall is rubble, East and West merge. And suddenly Germany is back as this singular global heavyweight.
It was a massive geopolitical consolidation.
But then, if you blink, you miss it. Less than a year later, in May 1991, down in the Horn of Africa, Somaliland declares independence from the collapsing dictatorship of Somalia. They set up a border, they elect a government, they print money.
And for over 30 years now, they have maintained peace and stability in a very rough neighborhood.
And here is the puzzle, the thing that's been bugging me since I read through our sources for this deep dive.
Right.
Both of these places have a defined territory. Both have a distinct population. Both have a functioning government.
Right.
But today, Germany is the engine of Europe, a G7 leader, and Somaliland. Legally speaking, it doesn't even exist. It's a ghost.
It's the ultimate contradiction, and it forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. What actually makes a country a country? I mean, is it about how well you run the place, or is it about who your friends are?
I think most of us, myself included, have this vague idea that there's a checklist. You know, if you have a flag, a national anthem, and a police force, congratulations. Here is your seat at the United Nations.
That is the common assumption. And to be fair to you, there actually is a checklist. It's called the Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of States. It was signed way back in 1933, but it's still the gold standard in international law.
Okay, so lay it on us. What does the law actually say?
It's surprisingly short, really. To be a state, you need four things. First, a permanent population. You need people living there.
Reasonable.
Second, a defined territory. You need borders that you control. Third, a government. You need a structure that can maintain order.
Okay, so far Somaliland is 3 for 3. They have people, they have land, and they definitely have a government.
They do. In fact, our sources show they have held multiple democratic elections with peaceful transfers of power, which is something even some recognized states struggle with. But then you hit criteria number 4. And this is the trap.
Ah, the fine print.
The fourth requirement is the capacity to enter into relations with other states.
Wait a minute. That sounds completely circular.
It is effectively circular. To be a state, you must be able to talk to other states diplomatically. But other states won't talk to you diplomatically unless they already recognize you as a state.
So it's the geopolitical equivalent of an entry-level job requiring 5 years of experience.
That is a perfect analogy. And this is exactly where legal theory crashes headfirst into political reality. If you look at the Montevideo Convention, Somaliland should be a state. But the world isn't run by lawyers, it's run by politics.
So the checklist is just a piece of paper. The real game is happening in the back room.
Exactly. And to understand the rules of that back room, we really have to look at how Germany pulled off its reunification. Because it wasn't as simple as just tearing down a wall and hugging it out.
Yeah, let's dig into that, because looking back, the narrative is always about freedom and democracy winning.
Right.
You know, David Hasselhoff singing on the ruins of the wall, it feels inevitable.
It was anything but inevitable. You have to remember the context here. This is 1990. The Soviet Union is crumbling, yes, but it still has thousands of tanks and nuclear weapons sitting in East Germany. And frankly, the neighbors, France and the UK, they were terrified.
Terrified of a democratic Germany.
They weren't worried about democracy, they were worried about power. History has a long memory. A unified Germany had started 2 world wars in the previous century. Margaret Thatcher in the UK and President Mitterrand in France were deeply anxious about a dominant Germany emerging in the center of Europe again.
So it wasn't just high fives all around.
Not at all. There's a famous line attributed to a French novelist that was circulating at the time. I love Germany so much that I am glad there are 2 of them.
Ouch. So how did they get past that? If the neighbors were hostile and the Soviets were suspicious, how did it happen?
It required a master class in diplomacy called the 2+4 Treaty.
2 + 4. Sounds like a math equation.
Well, the 2 were East and West Germany. They had to agree to merge, so that's your internal consent. But the 4 were the World War II victors. The United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. Because of the post-war occupation rights, Germany literally could not reunify without their permission.
Let me get this straight. Germany, this massive economic powerhouse, essentially needed a permission slip signed by its parents.
In a way, yes, and they had to pay a steep price for it. This is the part people forget. Germany didn't just get to be a state again for free. They had to prove they wouldn't be a threat.
Right, they had to make concessions.
Huge ones. They agreed to limit their military size. They formally renounced nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. And most importantly, they agreed to bind themselves tightly into the European Union and NATO.
I see. So the deal was, we will let you reunite, but only if you promise to tie your own hands and integrate so deeply that you can never go rogue again.
Precisely. It was a trade of sovereignty for security. And because the great powers, specifically the US and the Soviets, saw a strategic benefit to this new stability, they signed the paper. The stars basically aligned between the legal desire of the German people and the strategic interests of the global superpowers.
Okay, so that's the gold standard. You get the internal agreement, you get the superpowers on board, and you get the neighbors to begrudgingly accept it. Now, let's pivot back to Somaliland.
A very different story.
So, Somaliland declares independence in 1991 after a brutal civil war with the regime in Mogadishu. They pull back to their old colonial borders. Because interestingly, as the sources point out, Somaliland used to be a British protectorate while Somalia was Italian, right?
Correct. For a brief week in 1960, Somaliland was actually an independent state before voluntarily joining Somalia. So their argument today is, we aren't creating a new country. We are dissolving a failed union. We're just asking for our divorce.
That sounds completely logical. If I get married and it becomes abusive, I can get a divorce. I don't need my spouse's permission to leave.
In civil law, yes. In international law, not so much. This brings us to the first major hurdle Somaliland faces, the lack of mutual consent.
Somalia says no.
Somalia insists that Somaliland is still part of its sovereign territory. And unlike the Germany scenario where East and West shook hands, here you have a unilateral break. And the international community really hates unilateral moves.
But why? If Somaliland is peaceful, and the sources emphasize this over and over, they have their own currency, the Somaliland shilling, they have biometric passports, they have police, why does the world pretend they aren't there? It feels like we're gaslighting an entire nation.
It does feel that way on the ground. But the why brings us to the African Union and a very specific anxiety about opening Pandora's box.
The African Union is the regional club, kind of like the EU for Africa.
Yeah.
What is their specific issue with Somaliland?
It goes all the way back to 1964. Most African nations were just gaining independence, but their borders were a total mess. They had been drawn by Europeans in places like Berlin or London, often cutting right through ethnic groups or forcing historical enemies into the exact same country.
Right, just straight lines on a map that ignored the reality on the ground.
So the leaders faced a massive choice. Do we try to redraw all these borders to make sense? Or do we freeze them as they are? They realized that if they started redrawing borders, it would lead to endless wars. Every group would want their own state. It would be absolute chaos.
So they chose the devil they knew.
They signed a pledge to respect the borders inherited from colonialism. It's a legal doctrine called uti possidetis juris. Basically, what you have is what you keep.
And because Somaliland wants to change the map, or at least that's how the AU sees it, they are seen as a threat to that whole system.
Exactly. The fear isn't really just about Somalia, it's about the precedent. If the African Union recognizes Somaliland, what do they say to the separatists in Nigeria, or Cameroon, or Ethiopia? The fear is that if you pull this one loose thread, the entire regional sweater unravels.
So Somaliland is essentially being held hostage by a slippery slope argument. Like, we can't let you be free because then everyone will want to be free.
That is the core geopolitical calculation. The AU prioritizes stability, meaning unchanged borders over democracy or effective governance.
Which has to be incredibly frustrating when you think about the daily reality for someone living in Hargeisa, the capital of Somaliland. I mean, what does this non-recognition actually look like for a normal person living there?
It is suffocating. Imagine trying to run a business. You can't easily access the international banking system because your banks aren't recognized globally. You can't get a development loan from the World Bank.
What about travel? The sources mentioned passports.
The Somaliland passport is barely recognized anywhere. If you want to travel abroad, you often have to go to Mogadishu, the capital of the country you claim you aren't part of, to get a passport from a government that barely controls its own streets, just so you can hop on a plane.
That is absurd. You have to get a document from a failed state to leave your functioning state.
It perfectly highlights the difference between legitimacy and legality. Somaliland has legitimacy on the ground. The people support it, the institutions work, but it lacks legality on the international stage.
It reminds me of, okay, let's try an analogy. It's like the difference between being a really good driver and actually having a driver's license.
Oh, go on, let's hear this.
Well, you can be the best driver in the world. You use your turn signals, you parallel park perfectly, you never speed. That's Somaliland. They are doing the driving. But if the DMV doesn't give you that plastic card, the police are still going to pull you over. The system says you aren't a driver.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. In international relations, there are actually two competing philosophical theories about this, and you just nailed them without even knowing it.
Oh, I did? Am I accidentally a legal scholar now?
You are today.
Yeah.
The first is the declarative theory. That says if you function as a state, if you drive the car well, you are a state, period. Your existence is just a fact based on reality.
I like that theory. It makes logical sense.
But the opposing view is the constitutive theory. That says a state only exists if other states recognize it. The license makes the driver. And sadly for Somaliland, the modern global system leans heavily on the constitutive side.
So if we look back at the hidden rules we promised to uncover at the beginning of this deep dive, we can kind of map them out clearly now.
We can. They emerge right from the history.
Rule 1 seems to be, get the big guys on your side. Germany had the US and the Soviets. Somaliland has, well, nobody with veto power at the UN.
Correct. Strategic interest is key. Germany was essential to European security. Somaliland, while it is strategically located near the Red Sea, hasn't convinced a superpower that recognizing them is worth the headache of upsetting the African Union.
Which brings us to Rule 2. Don't scare the neighbors.
Right. Germany had to reassure France and the UK through major concessions. They integrated. Somaliland is trying to be a good neighbor, but the African Union is just terrified of the precedent, and if the regional club says no, the global club almost always follows suit.
And Rule 3 possession isn't 9/10 of the law.
Exactly. You can control the territory, you can have the army, you can collect the taxes, but without that political rubber stamp, you remain in limbo. Effectiveness does not equal recognition.
It really seems like the whole system is rigged to favor the status quo, no matter how dysfunctional that status quo actually is. I mean, Somalia has struggled with being a quote-unquote failed state for decades, yet it keeps its seat at the UN. Somaliland has been peaceful for decades and gets left out in the cold.
It creates a massive moral hazard, doesn't it? It suggests that international borders are somehow more important than the actual people living inside them. The map is treated as sacred, even if the reality on the ground has completely changed.
So is there any hope for Somaliland or places like it? Or are they just stuck in this zombie state status forever?
Well, geopolitics is never truly static. Things shift. We are starting to see cracks. Ethiopia, for example, has recently shown a lot of interest in Somaliland because they are landlocked and desperately need access to a port.
Ah, the strategic interest card again.
Exactly. If Ethiopia decides it needs Somaliland's port badly enough to break rank with the AAU and recognize them, that could trigger a domino effect. It goes right back to our first rule. If you have something a powerful player needs, the rules can bend.
So it's not really about justice, and it's not about checking boxes on the Montevideo Convention. At the end of the day, it's about leverage.
Always. Recognition is a transaction.
Yeah.
Germany had leverage, the stability of Europe. Somaliland is still looking for its leverage.
This has been a fascinating, if maybe slightly cynical, look at the world map. It really changes how you look at those lines. They aren't geography. They are just frozen politics.
They are decisions made by people in rooms often decades or even centuries ago. And as we've seen, unmaking those decisions is one of the hardest things in global politics.
There's a line from our sources that really sticks with me. In geopolitics, borders are not only drawn by history, they survive because the world agrees to accept them.
A very powerful thought to end on.
I want to leave you, the listener, with that to mull over. Next time you look at a globe, ask yourself who decided those lines and what kind of leverage is keeping them there. Thanks for diving deep with us today. We will see you next time.